Jennifer had been scrolling through real estate listings for months. Every house in her budget looked the same: small, cramped apartments or rundown properties in sketchy neighborhoods. As a middle school teacher, she didn't make much money, but after her divorce was finalized, she knew she needed a fresh start. Something that was truly hers. That's when she saw it. The listing had only 3 photos, and honestly, they weren't great. The images were dark and blurry, showing a tired-looking Victorian house with peeling paint and overgrown bushes blocking most of the front windows. But it was the price that made her do a double-take. $85,000. For a 3-bedroom house with original woodwork and a wraparound porch. She checked the listing again, thinking there must be a typo. Houses in that neighborhood usually went for at least $150,000, sometimes more. Even the tiny ranches and split levels cost more than what this place was listed for. Her finger hovered over the contact button. Part of her wondered if this was some kind of scam. But another part of her, the part that was tired of living in her sister's spare bedroom, decided to take a chance. She called the real estate agent listed on the page. The woman who answered sounded professional but tired. Her name was Linda, and she'd been trying to sell this house for almost 4 months. Right away, she was honest about why the price was so low. "I'm not going to lie to you," Linda said over the phone. "This place needs work. A lot of work. The plumbing is probably from the 1960s. The electrical system needs updating, and there's some foundation settling that should really be looked at." Jennifer felt her excitement deflate a little. Foundation problems sounded expensive, but Linda wasn't finished. The previous owner passed away about 6 months ago. She was elderly, lived alone, and didn't have much family. Her nieces and nephews inherited the place, but none of them live in the state. They just want to sell it quickly and split the money. They've already dropped the price twice. "Can I see it?" Jennifer asked before she could talk herself out of it. 2 days later, she stood in front of the house in person. It looked even worse than the photos suggested. The porch sagged on one side. Several windows had cracks running through them. The yard was a jungle of weeds and wild bushes. A real estate sign leaned crookedly near the mailbox. But when Linda unlocked the front door and Jennifer stepped inside, something shifted. Yes, the wallpaper was dated. Yes, the carpet was stained and worn. Yes, there was a musty smell that suggested water damage somewhere. But the bones of the house were beautiful. High ceilings with original plasterwork, hardwood floors underneath the terrible carpet, a stone fireplace in the living room, built-in bookshelves in what must have been a study. Jennifer walked through each room slowly. The kitchen was a disaster from the 1970s, all harvest gold appliances and laminate countertops. The bathrooms had pink tile and rust stains, but she could see past all of that. She could imagine what this place could become. "The owner who passed away," Jennifer said as they walked through the master bedroom. "How long did she live here?" Linda checked her folder. Her name was Dorothy Hartwell. She and her husband bought the place in 1940. He died in 1946, and she lived here alone ever since. Over 70 years in the same house. Jennifer tried to imagine that. 70 years of memories in these rooms. A whole life lived between these walls. It made her sad to think of the house sitting empty now, unwanted and neglected. "I know it's rough," Linda said gently, "but with some work it could really be something special. The structure is solid. It just needs someone who's willing to put in the time and money." Jennifer didn't have a lot of money, but she had time. Summer break was coming up, and she'd learned some basic renovation skills from watching way too many home improvement shows during her marriage. How hard could it be? She made an offer that same afternoon. $75,000, leaving her some budget for repairs. She expected a counteroffer, but the family accepted within 24 hours. They were just relieved to have someone willing to take it off their hands. The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, inspections, and meetings with the bank. The home inspector found exactly what Linda had warned about: old plumbing, outdated electrical, and some settling in the foundation that would need attention eventually. But nothing that made the house unlivable or dangerous. Just old Jennifer's sister thought she was crazy. Her parents were worried. Her friends asked if she was sure about taking on such a big project so soon after her divorce. But something about the house called to her. Maybe it was the fact that both she and the house needed a second chance. On moving day, Jennifer stood in the empty living room with her keys in hand. She didn't have much furniture, just what she'd kept from the divorce and a few pieces her parents had donated. The rooms looked even bigger empty. The house felt hollow, like it was waiting for life to return to it. She started small. The first week, she just cleaned. Room by room, she scrubbed floors, washed windows, and threw away decades of accumulated dust. In the kitchen, she found old newspapers from the 1980s lining the cabinets. In one closet, there were clothes that probably dated back to the 1950s, still hanging on wire hangers. Dorothy hadn't thrown much away, it seemed. In the attic, Jennifer found boxes of Christmas decorations, old photo albums, and stacks of magazines. It felt strange going through a stranger's life like this, but the family had told her to dispose of whatever she wanted. They'd already taken the few things they cared about. By the end of the second week, Jennifer was ready to tackle the bigger projects. She'd gotten quotes from 3 different contractors about the foundation work. They all said roughly the same thing. The southeast corner of the house had settled about 2 inches lower than the rest. It wasn't causing major problems yet, but it would need to be addressed eventually. The work would involve reinforcing the foundation and probably replacing some of the basement floor. She went with the contractor who seemed the most honest and whose price was in the middle. His name was Robert, and he'd been doing foundation work for 20 years. He promised to be careful with the house, to treat it with respect despite its age and condition. Old houses have character, he told her during their first meeting. They're built better than most of the new construction going up today. You made a good investment here. Jennifer hoped he was right. She'd sunk everything she had into this place. Her savings, her settlement from the divorce, and a small loan from her parents. This house was her future now, for better or worse. Robert and his crew showed up on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after Jennifer had moved in. They set up their equipment in the basement: jackhammers, concrete saws, wheelbarrows, and various tools she couldn't name. The plan was to break up the old basement floor in sections, reinforce the foundation walls, and pour a new floor. It would take about 2 weeks, Robert estimated, depending on what they found underneath. Jennifer went to work that day feeling nervous and excited. When she came home that afternoon, everything in her life was about to change. She just didn't know it yet. Jennifer was in the middle of teaching her 4th period English class when her phone buzzed in her desk drawer. She ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again. By the 4th buzz, she knew something was wrong. During the passing period, she checked her messages. 3 missed calls and 2 texts from Robert, the contractor. The last text simply said, "You need to come home. Found something. Call me." Her heart dropped. Foundation problems were expensive. Really expensive. She'd already stretched her budget to the breaking point. If they'd found something major, she didn't know what she would do. She called him back during her lunch break, stepping into the empty hallway outside the teacher's lounge. "What's wrong?" she asked as soon as he picked up. "How bad is it?" There was a strange pause on the other end. "It's not bad. It's just unusual. Can you come by after school? You really need to see this for yourself." "Can't you just tell me?" "I could," Robert said slowly. "But you wouldn't believe me." That didn't help her anxiety at all. Jennifer spent the rest of the school day distracted, barely paying attention to her students' presentations. What could be so unusual that he couldn't explain it over the phone? A sinkhole? Ancient burial ground? Her mind went to ridiculous places. When she finally pulled into her driveway at 3:30, Robert's truck was still there along with 2 other vehicles she didn't recognize. She found Robert and his crew standing in the basement, all of them staring at a spot in the floor near the southeast corner. "Okay, I'm here," Jennifer said, dropping her bag on the basement stairs. "What's going on?" Robert gestured to the floor. "We were breaking up the concrete in sections like I told you. Got through most of the northwest corner yesterday with no problems. This morning we started on this area here, and about 2 feet down we hit metal." Jennifer looked at the jagged hole they'd created in the concrete. She could see broken chunks of old cement, rebar, and dirt. "Metal like a pipe?" "That's what we thought at first," said Tom, one of Robert's crew members. "Old water pipe or maybe a gas line. But when we cleared more concrete away, we realized it wasn't a pipe at all." Robert knelt down beside the hole and brushed away some loose dirt with his hand. Jennifer stepped closer and peered down. In the beam of the work lights, she could see it clearly now. A square metal frame set into the ground. It looked like a door. "A hatch, is that?" Jennifer's voice trailed off. "A door?" "Yeah," Robert said. "We've been doing foundation work for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's built right into the ground under the concrete. Someone went to a lot of trouble to hide it." Jennifer's mind raced. This was her house, her property, which meant technically whatever was under that door belonged to her. But what could possibly be down there? And why would anyone seal it under the basement floor? "Have you opened it?" she asked. "We wanted to wait for you," Robert said. Seemed like the right thing to do. The three men looked at her expectantly. Jennifer realized her hands were shaking. This felt like one of those moments in movies right before everything changes. Part of her wanted to tell them to just seal it back up, pour the new concrete, and pretend they'd never found it. But the other part of her, the curious part that had made her buy this weird old house in the first place, needed to know what was down there. "Okay," she said. "Let's open it." Robert and Tom cleared away more concrete and dirt until the entire metal frame was visible. It was about 3 feet square, made of heavy steel that had rusted around the edges but still looked solid. There was a recessed handle on one side. Robert grabbed a crowbar and wedged it under the handle. "Might be stuck. This thing has probably been sealed for decades." He pulled hard. Nothing happened. Tom joined him, and together they leveraged the crowbar with their combined weight. There was a grinding sound of metal on metal, and then suddenly the hatch popped up an inch. A rush of stale air escaped from below, smelling of damp earth and old metal. "Got it," Robert grunted. They lifted the hatch the rest of the way and let it fall back with a heavy clang. Everyone stood there for a moment, staring down into the darkness below. Jennifer could see the top rungs of a metal ladder descending into a black space. "Anyone got a flashlight?" she asked. Tom handed her a heavy-duty work light. Jennifer clicked it on and pointed the beam down into the hole. The ladder went down about 8 feet and ended at a dirt floor. The light reflected off brick walls. It was a room. Someone had built an actual room under her basement. "Should we call someone?" Tom asked nervously. "Like the police or something?" "And tell them what?" Robert said. "We found a secret room. It's probably just an old root cellar or storage space. People used to build them all the time before refrigerators were common." That made sense. Jennifer had heard of root cellars before. But why seal it under concrete? Why not just leave it accessible? "I'm going down," she said before she could overthink it. "You sure?" Robert asked. "Could be unstable down there. Could be anything." "It's my house," Jennifer said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "I need to know what's down there." She handed Robert her phone. "If I'm not back up in 5 minutes, call for help." The ladder felt solid under her weight despite its age. Jennifer climbed down carefully, the work light clutched awkwardly in one hand. When her feet touched the dirt floor at the bottom, she took a moment to steady herself. The room was small, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. The walls were brick, old-fashioned red brick that looked like it had been laid by hand. The ceiling was low, just barely tall enough for her to stand upright. And there against the far wall sat 3 wooden crates stacked on top of each other. "What do you see?" Robert's voice echoed down from above. "Boxes," Jennifer called back. 3 wooden crates. Her heart was pounding now. She moved closer, shining her light on the crates. They were old, covered in dust and cobwebs with rope handles on the sides. The wood was dark with age but still looked solid. That's when she noticed something else. On the ground next to the crates was a book, a leather-bound journal with a strap buckled around it to keep it closed. Jennifer picked up the journal carefully. The leather was cracked and dry but intact. She unbuckled the strap and opened to the first page. The paper was yellowed and brittle, covered in neat handwritten text. At the top of the first page, in careful cursive, were the words, "Private Journal of William Hartwell. If found, please return to Dorothy Hartwell, 412 Maple Street. This address. This house." Jennifer's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Every page was filled with writing, dated entries spanning from 1943 to what looked like 1945. Some pages had lists of items with descriptions and numbers next to them. Others were full paragraphs of text. She looked at the crates again, then back at the journal. Dorothy Hartwell had been the previous owner, the woman who'd lived in this house for over 70 years, and William must have been her husband, the one who died back in 1946. "Jennifer, you okay down there?" Robert called. She looked up at the square of light above her head where 3 concerned faces peered down at her. "Yeah," she said. "I'm okay, but I think I need to bring some things up. Want help?" "No, give me a few minutes." Jennifer turned back to the crates. Her mind was spinning with questions. What was in these boxes? Why had William hidden them down here? And why had Dorothy never mentioned this room to anyone? She set the journal aside carefully and approached the first crate. The lid wasn't nailed down, just set on top. With shaking hands, she lifted it off. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, were objects. She unwrapped the first one and gasped. Even in the dim light of her work lamp, she could see what it was. A necklace. Not costume jewelry, but real jewelry. Diamonds caught the light and threw tiny rainbows across the brick walls. She unwrapped another piece. A gold bracelet with rubies. Then another. A brooch covered in sapphires. Another necklace with emeralds. Ring after ring. Each piece more elaborate than the last. Jennifer sat back on her heels, staring at the pile of jewelry in front of her. There had to be dozens of pieces just in this first crate, and there were 2 more crates waiting. This wasn't just an old root cellar or forgotten storage space. This was something else entirely. Something that someone had very deliberately hidden away. She picked up William's journal again and flipped to a random page near the middle. Her eyes caught on a single line. Received 3 pieces today from the Rosenberg family. I pray they find safety here. The Rosenberg family, 1943. Safety. Jennifer's breath caught in her throat as the pieces started falling into place. She thought about the dates. World War II. Families fleeing Europe. People desperate to protect whatever they had left. She climbed back up the ladder quickly, clutching the journal and one of the wrapped pieces of jewelry. Robert, she said as soon as her head cleared the opening. I need you to be a witness to something, and then I need to call the police. His eyes widened when he saw what was in her hands. Is that real? I think so, Jennifer said. And I think there's a lot more where this came from. Jennifer sat at her kitchen table that night, unable to sleep, reading William Hartwell's journal by lamplight. The police had come and gone, taking photos and making reports. They'd told her not to touch anything else in the hidden room until they could get specialists to document everything properly. But they'd let her keep the journal for now. After photographing every page, the story that unfolded in those yellowed pages was nothing like she'd expected. William Hartwell had owned a jewelry shop in downtown Chicago. The first entry was dated March 15, 1943, and his handwriting was neat and precise. The writing of someone who was used to working with tiny, delicate things. A man came into the shop today, the entry began. He spoke with an accent I couldn't quite place. German, perhaps, or Polish. He carried a small velvet bag and looked over his shoulder 3 times before he approached my counter. Inside the bag were 4 rings, 2 bracelets, and a necklace. All of exceptional quality. He said his family had just arrived from Belgium. He needed cash to start over, but he didn't trust the big dealers downtown. Someone had told him I was an honest man. Jennifer kept reading. The next entry was 2 days later. I gave him a fair price. More than fair, actually. I saw the desperation in his eyes. His wife and daughter were waiting outside the shop, looking thin and frightened. This man wasn't trying to cheat anyone. He was trying to survive. After he left, I couldn't stop thinking about the pieces he'd sold. They were family heirlooms, things that had probably been passed down for generations, and now he'd been forced to sell them just to feed his family. More entries followed, each one similar to the last. Families arriving from Europe with whatever valuables they could carry. Some wanted to sell immediately. Others asked William if he could hold their jewelry as collateral for loans. They promised to buy the pieces back once they got on their feet. William had agreed to all of it. But as Jennifer read further, she realized something. He'd never actually sold any of the pieces. Instead, he'd been keeping detailed records of every item, every family, every promise made. I've decided to build a safe room. One entry from July 1943 read, "The shop's safe isn't secure enough and I don't trust the banks. Too many questions. Too much paperwork. These families have been through enough already. They don't need the government knowing every detail of what they own. My house has a basement. The foundation is solid. I can build something there that no one will find." Jennifer felt chills reading those words. She was sitting in the house he'd written about. The basement where she'd found the hidden room was the same basement where William had stood 80 years ago, planning his secret. The entries continued through 1943 and into 1944. More families, more jewelry. William had been meticulous in his descriptions. He'd drawn little sketches of each piece, noted the weight, the type of stones, the quality of the metalwork. Next to each description, he'd written the family's name and a brief note about their situation. The Goldstein family. Father, mother, 3 children, Arrived from Austria. The mother cried when she handed me her wedding ring. I told her it was just temporary. She'll get it back. The Rosenberg family. 2 sisters traveling alone. Their parents didn't make it out. They're living in a boarding house on the south side. They have nothing except the jewelry their mother sewed into their coat linings. The Klein family. Elderly couple. They lost everything except what they could carry. The husband's hands shake when he talks about what he saw. Every entry made Jennifer's chest tighten. These weren't just pieces of jewelry. They were remnants of lives torn apart. Each necklace, each ring, each bracelet represented a family's entire history, compressed into something small enough to hide, light enough to carry. By 1944, William had collected items from at least 20 different families. Some had taken loans and paid him back, reclaiming their pieces. Others were still working to earn enough money. William never pressured anyone. In fact, several entries mentioned him reducing the amounts owed or extending deadlines indefinitely. The Berman family came in today. One entry from October 1944 read, "They wanted to buy back the necklace they'd left with me 18 months ago. But when I told them the amount they owed, Mr. Berman's face fell. He said they'd had unexpected medical expenses. Their son had been sick. I told them not to worry about it. I reduced what they owed by half. The look of relief on their faces was worth more than any profit. Jennifer could see what kind of man William had been. Not a businessman trying to make money off desperate people, but someone trying to help however he could. The jewelry shop must have been just barely breaking even with the way he conducted business. The entries became less frequent in 1945. William mentioned being tired often. His handwriting, always so neat, started to look shakier. Some entries were just lists of items and families, as if he didn't have the energy to write full paragraphs anymore. The last entry was dated August 10, 1945, just 5 days before Japan surrendered and the war ended. "My health is failing," William wrote. "I can feel it. The doctor says it's my heart, but I think it's more than that. I'm 63 years old and I'm tired, so tired. There are still 12 families who haven't reclaimed their items. I keep meaning to contact them, but I can barely make it through a day at the shop anymore. Dorothy knows about the business, but I haven't told her about the room. I keep meaning to, I need to. But every time I start to explain, the words won't come. How do I tell her I've been hiding a fortune under our house? She'll think I've lost my mind. I'll tell her soon, I have to. These families are counting on me." That was where the journal ended. No more entries. No explanation of what happened next. Jennifer knew from the real estate paperwork that William had died in 1946, less than a year after that last entry. He must have had the heart attack or stroke he'd been worried about. And clearly he'd never told Dorothy about the room. She imagined Dorothy grieving her husband, having no idea that there was a secret buried beneath her feet. Living alone in this house for 70 years, walking across that basement floor thousands of times, never knowing what was hidden just a few feet below. Jennifer flipped back through the journal, looking at the names William had written: the Goldstein family, the Rosenberg family, the Klein family, the Berman family. There were others too. The Levy family, the Cohen family, the Weiss family. 16 families in total, according to William's careful records. She wondered what had happened to them. Had they survived the war years? Had they built new lives in America? Did they have children, grandchildren? Were any of them still alive? And more importantly, did any of them remember the jewelry they'd left with a kind shopkeeper in Chicago all those years ago? The police detective who'd taken her statement had been professional but skeptical. She could see it in his eyes. He thought this was probably nothing. Old costume jewelry from the 1940s, maybe worth a few $100s if she was lucky. He'd told her they'd send someone from their property crimes unit to document everything, but it could take a few days. Jennifer had nodded and thanked him, but she knew he was wrong. The pieces she'd seen weren't costume jewelry. Even with her limited knowledge, she could tell they were real. The weight of them, the way the stones caught the light, these were valuable pieces. But their monetary value wasn't what kept her awake that night. It was the thought of those families. People who'd fled their homes with whatever they could carry, trusting a stranger to keep their precious belongings safe. People who probably assumed everything was lost when William died without a trace of what he'd been holding for them. She went back down to the basement before bed, standing at the edge of the hole in the concrete floor. Robert had placed wooden boards over the opening for safety, but Jennifer moved them aside and shined her flashlight down into the room. The 3 crates sat exactly where she'd left them. She'd only opened one. The other 2 were still sealed, their contents unknown. Tomorrow, the police would send their specialists. They'd document everything, catalog every piece, and then start the long process of figuring out what to do with it all. Legally, as the homeowner, Jennifer might have a claim to whatever was down there. The detective had mentioned something about treasure trove laws and finders keepers, but Jennifer had already made up her mind about that. This wasn't her treasure to keep. These items belonged to the families William had tried to protect. Even if those families were long gone, even if she could never find them, it felt wrong to claim something that had never been meant for her. She thought about Dorothy, living in this house all those years, never knowing. Maybe it was better that way. Dorothy had been alone after William died. If she'd known about the fortune hidden in her basement, it might have consumed her. The weight of that secret, the responsibility of it. Now that weight was on Jennifer's shoulders. She'd bought this house looking for a fresh start, a simple renovation project to keep her busy and give her a sense of purpose. Instead, she'd inherited someone else's unfinished promise. She replaced the boards over the opening and went back upstairs. Tomorrow would be a long day, but tonight she kept reading William's journal, learning about the families who'd trusted him, trying to memorize their names and stories. Somewhere out there, those families or their descendants might still exist, and if they did, Jennifer was determined to find them. It's what William would have wanted. It's what felt right. The house had been cheap. The treasure beneath it was priceless. But what mattered most wasn't the value of what she'd found. It was the chance to finish what William Hartwell had started 80 years ago. The FBI agents arrived 3 days later. Jennifer had expected maybe one person, someone from the local police department. Instead, 2 federal agents in dark suits showed up at her door with credentials and serious expressions. They introduced themselves as specialists from the art crime team. Art crime team? Jennifer repeated, confused. But this is jewelry, not paintings. The taller agent, a woman named Agent Chen, smiled slightly. We handle all kinds of stolen cultural property. Historic artifacts, jewelry, anything that might have been illegally obtained or belongs to someone else. When the police report mentioned items possibly connected to Holocaust refugees, they called us immediately. Jennifer led them down to the basement, where the hidden room was still open. Over the past 3 days, she'd barely slept. She'd spent every free moment reading and rereading William's journal, making notes, trying to create some kind of system to track all the families he'd mentioned. The agents spent hours in the basement, photographing everything, carefully removing each piece from the crates and documenting them. They wore white gloves and handled everything with incredible care. Jennifer watched from the top of the ladder, feeling anxious and protective even though she knew this was necessary. By the end of the first day, they'd cataloged the contents of all 3 crates. The final count was staggering. 63 pieces of jewelry, 14 loose gemstones in small leather pouches, each with a tiny paper tag in faded ink, 8 silver candlesticks, a collection of gold coins, 6 pocket watches, and several items that Agent Chen said were likely religious artifacts. The total value, Agent Chen said, consulting her notes as they sat in Jennifer's kitchen that evening, is somewhere between $2 and $3.5 million, maybe more depending on the provenance and historical significance. Jennifer felt dizzy. She'd known the items were valuable, but hearing an actual number made it real in a way it hadn't been before. But the monetary value isn't really the point here, Agent Chen continued. These items represent something much more important. They're pieces of family history that people thought were lost forever. Our job now is to figure out who they belong to and try to find those families or their descendants. That's what I want too, Jennifer said quickly. I don't want to keep any of this. It's not mine. The other agent, a younger man named Agent Patel, looked up from his laptop. Legally, it's complicated. As the property owner, you could make a claim. But given the circumstances and the historical context, we'd encourage you to work with us to identify the rightful owners. I will, Jennifer said. Whatever it takes. I've been going through William's journal. He listed 16 families, but he only used first names and general descriptions. No addresses or detailed records, Agent Chen nodded. That's actually pretty common for the time period. People were afraid of keeping too many records. Afraid of the wrong people finding information, William was probably trying to protect them. Over the next 2 weeks, the investigation became Jennifer's entire life. She took time off work, using her remaining sick days and personal leave. The story had leaked to a local news reporter somehow, and within days it was everywhere. Local news picked it up first, then state news, and finally national outlets. Jennifer's phone rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Historians wanted to examine William's journal. Random people called claiming to be descendants of the families mentioned, though most had no proof and were clearly hoping for a payout. The FBI helped her set up a system to handle the inquiries. They created an email address and a phone number that went straight to their office. They also assigned a genealogist to work on the case, someone who specialized in tracking down families displaced during World War II. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday morning. Jennifer was sitting in her kitchen, drinking her third cup of coffee and staring at William's journal for the 100th time, when Agent Chen called. "We found someone," she said, and Jennifer could hear the excitement in her voice. "A man named David Rosenberg. He's 78 years old, lives in Florida now, and his grandmother was one of the 2 sisters William mentioned in his journal." The Rosenberg family. Jennifer's heart started racing. "Are you sure?" "He has documentation. Letters his grandmother saved, photos, even a receipt from William's jewelry shop dated 1943. He saw the news story and contacted us immediately. He's flying up tomorrow. He wants to meet you." The next day, Jennifer waited nervously in her living room. The FBI agents arrived first. Then a few minutes later, a car pulled up outside. An elderly man got out slowly, using a cane. He was tall and thin, with white hair and kind eyes that looked too big behind thick glasses. Agent Chen made the introductions. David shook Jennifer's hand with both of his, holding on for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Thank you for calling the police. Thank you for not just keeping everything. Thank you for caring about where these things came from." They sat in the living room, and David opened a worn folder he'd brought with him. Inside were photographs, letters, and documents yellowed with age. "This is my grandmother Rachel and her sister Esther," he said, pointing to a black and white photo of 2 young women. "They arrived in Chicago in 1943. They were 19 and 21 years old. The rest of their family didn't make it out of Poland." Jennifer looked at the photo. The 2 women were beautiful, with dark eyes and serious expressions. They wore simple dresses and no jewelry. The photo had been taken in what looked like a cheap studio. "My grandmother used to tell me stories," David continued, "about the jeweler who helped them when they first arrived. She said he was the kindest man she'd ever met. He gave them a fair loan using their mother's jewelry as collateral, and he never pressured them to pay it back. It took them almost 2 years, but they eventually earned enough to reclaim the pieces." "William wrote about them," Jennifer said softly, opening the journal to a page she'd marked. "Here," he says, 2 sisters traveling alone. They're living in a boarding house on the south side. They have nothing except the jewelry their mother sewed into their coat linings." David's eyes filled with tears. "That's them. That's exactly right. My grandmother told me that story 100 times. How their mother had sewn the jewelry into their coats before they left. How it was all they had left of their family." He pulled out another photograph. This one showed the same 2 women, but older now, maybe in their 30s. They were smiling, dressed nicely, and both wearing jewelry. Beautiful necklaces that caught the light even in the old photo. "This was taken in 1950, David said, after they'd gotten the jewelry back from William. My grandmother wore that necklace on every special occasion for the rest of her life. My mother wore it at her wedding. My sister wore it at hers." Jennifer felt confused. "But if they got the jewelry back, then why is it in my basement?" David shook his head. "Not all of it. My grandmother reclaimed 3 pieces, but there were others. Things that had belonged to friends from their village who didn't survive. Things that other families had asked them to carry out. My grandmother tried to find William again in 1948 after the war ended, and she'd saved up enough money. She wanted to see if any other families had come back for their items. But when she went to his shop, it was closed. The building had been sold. She had no idea where he'd gone." Agent Chen pulled out a folder of photographs showing the items from the basement. "Can you identify any of these pieces?" David went through them slowly, his hands trembling. He stopped at one photograph and gasped. It showed a brooch, silver with small blue stones arranged in a flower pattern. "This belonged to the Levy family," he said quietly. My grandmother's best friend was Hannah Levy. They grew up together in Poland. Hannah's mother gave this brooch to my grandmother before they escaped, made her promise to sell it if they needed money to survive. Hannah and her mother were supposed to follow them to America, but they never made it. My grandmother felt guilty her whole life that she survived and they didn't. She tried to find Hannah's relatives after the war, but there was no one left. Agent Patel was taking notes rapidly. Do you know if the Levy family had any other relatives? Anyone who might have survived? David shook his head. My grandmother looked for years. She never found anyone. The room fell quiet for a moment. Jennifer thought about Hannah Levy and her mother, about the brooch they'd entrusted to Rachel, about how it had ended up in William's safe room and stayed there for 80 years. Over the next few weeks, more people came forward. Some had legitimate connections to the families William had helped. Others brought documentation that proved their grandparents or great-grandparents had worked with William's jewelry shop. A woman named Ruth Klein flew in from California. Her grandfather had left 4 rings with William in 1944. She brought the original receipt written in William's handwriting and photographs of her grandfather wearing one of the rings before the war. A man named Jacob Berman contacted the FBI through email. His grandmother had been one of the families William wrote about. She'd reclaimed most of her items, but one necklace had been left behind because she could never save up enough money to buy it back. The necklace was in one of the crates. Each person who came forward brought stories. Stories of survival, of loss, of families torn apart and put back together in new ways. Stories of kindness received from strangers during the darkest times. And over, stories about William Hartwell, the quiet jeweler who'd tried to help in the only way he knew how. By the end of the 6th week, investigators had traced ownership of about 60% of the items. 5 families had been located and contacted. Some were emotional reunions with objects that held deep meaning. Others were more complicated, with multiple relatives claiming ownership or disagreements about what should happen to the items. But there was still 40% that couldn't be traced. Items from families that had no living descendants or families that had simply disappeared into history, with no records left behind. Agent Chen sat with Jennifer one evening, both of them exhausted from weeks of intense investigation. You've done an incredible thing here, Agent Chen said. Most people would have kept quiet about this, sold everything privately. You chose differently. Jennifer looked down at William's journal, which never left her side anymore. It wasn't really a choice. William trusted these families, and they trusted him. I couldn't betray that. Still, Agent Chen said, the families we've found, they're grateful beyond words. And legally, you're entitled to compensation for the items that can't be traced. The law is actually pretty clear about that. Jennifer hadn't thought much about that part. She'd been so focused on finding the families that she hadn't considered what would happen to the items that had no one to claim them. What happens next? She asked. Agent Chen smiled. That's what we need to talk about. 6 months after finding the hidden room, Jennifer stood in a museum conference room surrounded by people whose lives had intersected with hers in the strangest way possible. The families who'd been found, historians who'd studied William's journal, representatives from Holocaust education organizations, and reporters from 3 different news networks. The items that had been successfully traced to families were being returned today, in a formal ceremony that someone had organized without really asking Jennifer if she wanted all this attention. She didn't. But she understood why it mattered to everyone else. David Rosenberg sat in the front row, the brooch that had belonged to Hannah Levy's mother resting in a velvet box on his lap. He'd asked if he could have it, even though it hadn't belonged to his family. He wanted to donate it to a Holocaust museum in Hannah's memory, so her name wouldn't be forgotten. Ruth Klein stood near the window, crying quietly as she held the rings her grandfather had left behind. Her daughter stood beside her, one hand on her mother's shoulder. 3 generations connected by pieces of metal and stone. The Berman family had sent a representative, a grandson who'd flown in from New York. He clutched the necklace his grandmother had never been able to afford to reclaim. Looking overwhelmed by the whole experience, Agent Chen stepped up to a small podium someone had set up. Today represents the end of a long journey for these families, and the completion of a promise made 80 years ago by William Hartwell. Thanks to Jennifer's integrity and determination, these items are finally going home. Everyone turned to look at Jennifer. She felt her face get hot. She'd never been comfortable with attention, and this was more than she'd ever wanted. But she forced a smile and nodded. The ceremony continued with each family receiving their items officially, with paperwork signed and photographs taken. There were tears and hugs, stories shared, people thanking Jennifer over and over until she felt embarrassed by all the gratitude. But the ceremony was only part of the story. The real complicated part came after, when everyone had gone home and Jennifer sat in Agent Chen's office to discuss what would happen next. The items we couldn't trace, Agent Chen said, spreading photographs across her desk. 26 pieces in total, plus the loose gemstones and some of the religious artifacts. We've exhausted every lead. No living relatives, no documentation, no way to determine ownership. Jennifer had known this was coming, but it still felt heavy. 26 pieces that represented families erased from history so completely that even their jewelry couldn't find its way home. Under treasure trove law, Agent Chen continued, you're legally entitled to claim these items as the property owner. You found them, you reported them, you cooperated with the investigation. No one would question your right to keep them. Jennifer looked at the photographs. A ruby ring, a diamond bracelet, a set of emerald earrings, each one worth thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars. Together, they represented a fortune. But, Agent Chen said carefully, there's another option. Several museums and educational organizations have expressed interest in the items. They'd like to display them as part of Holocaust remembrance exhibits. Some have offered to purchase them, with the funds going to related causes. Jennifer picked up one of the photos, a simple gold locket, the kind that might hold tiny pictures inside. She wondered whose faces had once been in that locket. Whose children, whose parents, whose loved ones had been carried close to someone's heart. I don't want to keep them, Jennifer said quietly. That's not why I called the police. That's not why I spent 6 months helping with the investigation. I know, Agent Chen said, but you deserve something for what you've done. You could have sold everything quietly. You could have claimed finders keepers. Instead, you spent half a year of your life tracking down strangers to return their family heirlooms. Jennifer thought about her house, still half renovated. The foundation work had been finished, but she'd had to put everything else on hold during the investigation. She'd burned through her savings and was back to living paycheck to paycheck. Her sister had been asking when she'd finish the house, when she'd get back to her normal life. What if, Jennifer said slowly, we sold the unclaimed items, but instead of me keeping all the money, we split it. Some for me, some for Holocaust education programs. Agent Chen smiled. I was hoping you'd say something like that. Over the next month, arrangements were made. A specialized auction house agreed to handle the sale of the unclaimed items. Museums bid on the pieces they wanted for exhibits. Private collectors purchased others, with the understanding that the jewelry carried historical significance. The final amount raised was just over $1 million. True to her word, Jennifer took only 40%, $400,000. It was more money than she'd ever imagined having. Enough to finish her house renovations completely. Enough to pay off her debts. Enough to feel secure for the first time in years. The remaining $600,000 was divided between 3 different organizations dedicated to Holocaust education and remembrance. One of them used the money to create a special exhibit featuring William Hartwell's story, with his journal displayed alongside photographs of the families he'd helped. But money wasn't the only thing Jennifer received. David Rosenberg and several other family members had insisted on showing their gratitude in other ways. They'd refused to take no for an answer. You gave us back pieces of our history, David had told her during one of his visits. You can't put a price on that. Please let us do something for you. In the end, Jennifer accepted a gift that meant more to her than money ever could. The families pooled together to create a scholarship fund in William and Dorothy Hartwell's names. The scholarship would go to children of refugees and immigrants, helping them pursue education and build new lives in America, just like the families William had helped all those years ago. Jennifer was named as one of the trustees of the fund, which meant she'd help choose scholarship recipients every year. It felt right, like the story had come full circle. Her house was finally finished by the end of the year. The foundation was solid. The plumbing and electrical were all updated. She'd restored the original woodwork and refinished the floors. The Victorian beauty that she'd seen hidden under decades of neglect had finally emerged. But she'd made one change to her original plans. The hidden room in the basement wasn't sealed up and forgotten. Instead, she'd had it carefully preserved and turned into a small memorial space. William's journal hung on one wall, encased in protective glass. On another wall, she'd mounted photographs of all the families who'd been reunited with their items, along with brief descriptions of their stories. It wasn't open to the public, but she brought friends down to see it sometimes. Students from her school came on field trips. Families who'd been helped by the scholarship fund visited. It became a quiet place of remembrance, a reminder of how one person's kindness could echo across generations. One evening, almost exactly a year after she'd found the hidden room, Jennifer sat on her newly restored porch watching the sunset. Her sister pulled up in her car and came to sit beside her. "So," her sister said, "was it worth it? All the chaos, all the media attention, all the time you spent on this instead of just fixing up your house?" Jennifer thought about the question. She thought about David crying as he held his grandmother's friend's brooch, about Ruth seeing her grandfather's rings after decades of believing they were lost, about the scholarship recipients who'd already been selected for next year, kids who reminded her so much of the families William had helped. "Yeah," she said finally. "It was worth it." Her sister nodded, then smiled. "You know what's funny? You bought the cheapest house on the market because you were broke and desperate, and somehow you ended up doing something that actually mattered." Jennifer laughed. "I guess that's one way to look at it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching neighbors walk their dogs and kids ride bikes down the street. Normal life, the kind Jennifer had been craving when she first bought this house. "Do you ever wonder," her sister asked, "why Dorothy never found the room? She lived here for 70 years. Don't you think that's weird?" Jennifer had wondered about that a lot. She'd come up with a theory, though she'd never know if it was true. "I think maybe Dorothy knew," she said quietly. "Maybe William told her before he died, or maybe she found it herself later. But she was afraid. Afraid of what it meant, afraid of the responsibility, so she just left it alone. Easier to pretend it didn't exist than to figure out what to do with it." "That's sad," her sister said. "Maybe," Jennifer agreed. "Or maybe she just wasn't ready. Maybe it took someone like me, someone with nothing to lose, to be brave enough to open that door." Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from David. He sent her photos every few weeks, usually of his grandkids or his garden. This time it was a picture of the museum exhibit featuring William's story. Hundreds of people were lined up to see it. "This is your legacy too," his message said. "Thank you for caring." Jennifer smiled and put her phone away. She looked at her house, at the porch she'd rebuilt, at the windows she'd replaced, at the garden she was planning to plant next spring. She'd bought this house because it was cheap, because it was all she could afford, because she was desperate for a fresh start. She'd found a treasure beneath it, but the real treasure wasn't the jewelry or the money. It was the reminder that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something, is always worth it in the end. William Hartwell had learned that lesson 80 years ago. Dorothy had lived with the weight of it, whether she acknowledged the room or not. And now Jennifer carried it forward, finishing the promise William had started and creating something new from the pieces of the past. But the lessons it taught her, the lives it touched, and the good that came from one choice to do the right thing,